This interview is with a fascinating individual with an incredible life story. DJ Admiral, aka Andy Kasrils, is a founder of the African Storm Reggae sound system, a South African celebrity and a TV movie reviewer. He's also the son of Ronnie and Eleanor Kasrils, who are two of the leading lights in the ANC's revolutionary struggle against apartheid. And probably most important of all, he's one of my oldest friends. We've known each other since we were teenagers in the late 1970s. In this interview we talk about how Andy went from his North London teenage years through being an ANC fighter in Angola to arriving in Johannesburg in the year of its first democratic election to becoming South Africa's best known reggae DJ. So, Andy, hello.
Hello, Jerry. Hello.
Or DJ Admiral, you might prefer.
Yeah, Admiral, exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
We're going to stick to
Strange
Admiral.
that, but yeah, DJ Admiral comes up as well.
So I don't know how to introduce you because I could introduce you many things, but maybe I'll start with Reggae King of South Africa, and then I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Oh, right. Okay. So the reason why my old friend from childhood, Jerry, is talking to me today is because I'm sitting in South Africa. I grew up in London. Parents from South Africa, exiled, South African struggle. Long story short, I've been living in South Africa since the mid-90s. As far as the music goes, yeah, I've had a career as a DJ, and me and my partner have run a reggae sound system, a dancehall sound system here in Johannesburg up until COVID, playing every week for 24 years on Thursday nights. So we're very much a fixture in the South African reggae scene, and more than that, a fixture in the South African club scene on Thursday nights. So that's kind of what I've been known for here over the years. Also quite a long career as a television film critic in South Africa.
And you're so you're a movie critic, and you write stuff. You share me links of stuff you've written.
Oh,
Sometimes I look at them and but yeah, I mean, yeah. So I've got you here because, as you said, we're old mates, and secondly, you've got a really interesting story and really interesting political kind of point of view, a really interesting political story to tell, and as well as a interesting, musical story. And we shared this love of reggae, among other things. And I don't think I haven't seen you since 2012, other than like via.
Is that when you last came here?
Yeah, I came down to South Africa in 2012, and
I think I saw you the year after. I haven't been in London for a long time, but I think I saw you in 2013 in London at your place then in Willesden, I believe.
Right. That was probably after my son was born, so I don't remember very much that's happened in the last 7 years, basically. But yeah, that's what children do to you. So yeah, sorry about that. And yeah, I mean, you mentioned your parents. So back then you used to live in North London when we first met, kind of late 70s probably. And your parents were fascinating characters. They were both ANC. They were exiles. They'd been members of the ANC, and they were members of the South African Communist Party, if that's right.
That's right.
And kind of both of us were part of the North London lefty scene. We went to the Woodcraft Folk, which was like the left-wing version of the Scouts, and that's how we met. But yeah, so yeah, we're kind of, I guess there were a lot of revolutionaries and exiles and those kind of weird types in London back then. But yeah, from what I remember, so I used to come around. We kind of did teenage stuff, but your parents would be appearing and disappearing for periods of time without kind of saying necessarily where they were going. I think your dad spent a fair bit of time in Mozambique.
So yeah, well, after 1976, the Soweto uprisings in South Africa, June 16th, my dad, both my parents, as you saying, ANC activists in exile, and my father at that point, after 1976, when there was a swelling of the ranks in the ANC. A lot of people leaving the country, jumping the border fence, wanting to join the struggle. There was struggle taking place inside South Africa, and the ANC officially based outside South Africa in the neighboring countries. And with the swelling of the ranks as a result of 1976 uprisings, he moved to Southern Africa, or back to Southern Africa, to enlarge to work on enlarging the military camps, which were based primarily in Angola. Right. You know, that was when the struggle against apartheid really stepped up again. It then happened again in the 1980s. But yes, so from about 1977, our dad was mainly in Southern Africa.
Yeah, and this was kind of the backdrop to our upbringing. So, you know, being in, you know, lefty families and living in North London, like apartheid was one of the big struggles. And I guess it was kind of coming of age. We would have been 12 or 11 at the time of the Soweto uprising. It was the kind of thing that kind of burst you out of your childhood bubble and made you realize that there were weird and shitty things going on in the world. So I've got randomly, I've still got a mug from 1986 commemorating the 1976, which just goes to show how deeply embedded I was in the struggle. But, you know, keeping my mugs for that long. I've got a Karl Marx mug as well. But it was,
hold on to those. They're going to come back into fashion again.
Yeah, Louise. I'm sure Louise is going to smash them one day, and then I'll be really upset.
More likely, it's going to be your kids, Jerry.
Yeah, whoever it is going to be out the house if they break my Soweto mug. But so, and what had happened in Soweto was, just for the youths watching, was that police had opened fire on school student protests and killed a bunch of people. Is that right?
Yes. So in 1976, there were protests against many different protests, but this one in particular was about school kids and the school organized union of school kids protesting against the teaching of school curriculum in Afrikaans. Afrikaans being one of the two colonial languages in South Africa, English and Afrikaans.
Right, so English was the preferred language.
Well, so what they were saying was, don't teach us in Afrikaans. You've got to remember, just to put it into context here for people who don't know, that South Africa is a country that has 11 official national languages. Yes, for colonial reasons, English is spoken, but at the same time, even today, you know, English is the language of global commerce. It's a very easily adopted language for making conversation simple amongst when there's many languages taking place at the same time. That demonstration was about boycotting Afrikaans being taught in Afrikaans in 1976, right. And it led to further widespread uprisings, specifically in the name of the African National Congress.
And also, I mean, this was kind of the backdrop, as I say, to our youth, but very specifically to your youth, because your family was directly involved in all this. But yeah, I remember kind of incidents like you and me and some friends had headed off to Portobello Road with our hard saved money. We'd saved for several weeks. We got to Portobello Road, and it must have been like 14 or 15, and I think the aim was to buy some drugs, some cannabis, and we kind of hit Portobello Road, and we found the one bloke who would sell weed to a bunch of 15-year-olds wandering up and down the street looking lost, and probably it was mostly oregano, but and then we kind of, you know, so we spent our money, came back to your place, hid it away somewhere, and we realized we needed Rizzler, so we went out again, to get Rizzlers and came back and the weed was gone, and we kind of scrabbled around your room just like looking for this weed. And eventually I think your dad came upstairs and said, I think I know what you're looking for, boys. And then he kind of sat us down and he gave us a kind of revolutionary speech on drugs and the revolutionary will, and how drugs set the revolutionary will, and you know, this really kind of Marxist approach on why you've thrown out weed in the bin. And yeah, it's so again, you know,
well, it was a good job we got ripped off, and it was mainly cooking herbs then, isn't it?
Yeah, I think yeah, it was pretty rare that we managed to actually buy proper drugs at that stage in our lives, but we did try. But yeah, but yeah, the other stuff that was the backdrop to our lives, of course, was music. And I was at a school where 3/4 of the kids were from a West Indian background, so that reggae soundtrack was, you know, pretty much the soundtrack of my late 70s and early 80s, and you know, I'm sure very similar to you. I mean, when do you remember just falling in love with reggae?
Oh yeah, well, so it was always been around in the house because my mum loved reggae amongst other music. So, and it's funny you ask this now because this is the very week that Toots Hibbert has died.
Yeah.
Toots and the Maytels were one of her favorites. So having Toots and the Maytels in the background, Bob Marley, whoever it was very common in growing up. So the music was there. But it was when I was in school in my teenage that I got interested in, through another friend at school. You know, what was in at that time was the roots, reggae, and dub music was really going through its kind of prime phase, you know. And funny enough, that's why talking to you, two old sort of like childhood friends getting together for a chat here, it was your friends later in the early 80s, Tris and Gab, and going round to their house in Kensal Rise near you.
Yeah.
I think you were off busy having a kid at that time, and hanging out there. And, you know, the thing about Kensal Rise is, you know, there's a local sound system, which was, or may still be, Java. Them and their friends was into what was happening in reggae at that time, which, you know, suddenly there was this kind of access to, and that was this new phase of rub-a-dub music and the sound system culture changing. You know, the tracks like Diseases, Another One Bites the Dust, you know, Michigan and Smiley, Yellow Man, all of that happening. And this,
so that me, was this kind of the, it got kind of a harder edge, more like almost a rap kind of thing. It was at the beginning of Ragga and dancehall and that kind of
thing. I think it just preceded that. It was still rub-a-dub. That's what it was called, you know. I think that really happens more in the mid-80s when the music changed and started becoming digital music. That was really the big change. A couple of the rhythms that came out, the slang tech rhythm and what have you. But like I'm saying, for me, that early 80s was the gateway to sound system culture. That's what it was. And like if you're into reggae and then suddenly you're into the sound system culture, like there's no going back. You're in the thing now.
I lived in Kensal Rise. I came back to live in Kensal Rise after my time in exile, having a baby. And still, one of the great things about Kensal Rise was at carnival time, you could walk 3 minutes down the road and you're in carnival. And it was like, I would wake up in the morning, I had these old wooden sash windows, kind of slightly rotten sash windows that were popular on the buildings at the time. And the first thing I'd hear on the carnival day when I woke up was the windows going in their frames. And that was when and then you'd walk down the hill and you just felt the bass in the air, and the hairs go up on the back of your neck. And you're just in among this just noise, people, whistles, horns, and bass. And yeah, I mean, I still love that. And I take my kids to carnival. I think love of bass is a very innate thing, because some people just don't have that same kind of pure love, you know, pure ecstasy when they feel it. But my son, who's 7, same thing. The first time I took him down to Abashanti. Do you know that sound system? It's a dub sound system in London. And he just kind of stood near the speaker and kind of went, he's normally very talkative and jumpy, and he kind of went and kind of just stood there, just as though he'd been kind of paralyzed. And I kept
pacified.
I kept checking he was all right, because he just didn't look himself, and he kept going, yeah. And I was saying, do you want to go? And he was going, no. It was just good, the bass rippling through your body, you know, when it kind of feels like it is.
There's definitely something about the atmosphere of, you know, Jamaican dancehall and sound system culture that, especially for me at a very impressionable kind of age, really just hooked me. And I could only compare it in terms of the way it took me to say what it's like going to your first big football match for the first time when you're young, you know, going into a stadium. And of course, football's changed a lot since then, but in terms of the experience, something that really just kind of takes you away.
Yeah, it's that mixture of, it's the weight of people and all of it kind of combined. And I still literally go to the carnival Sunday, Monday every year. This year has been hard. Like, we've had no carnival. It's almost the first time.
Oh yeah, of course, the lockdown. So there was no carnival this year, no?
They did online, but what's the point of that? You know, so it literally it's got to be. It's probably, I could count on one hand the number of times I've missed it since 1980 or 1981 when I first went. And so that was weird. But yeah, it's that. And from, you know, that Jamaican culture, I fell in love with it at school. I remember kids bringing in ghetto blasters and practicing skanks, or inventing new skanks to whatever the sounds were back in, you know, 78, 79, 80. So yeah, it hooks you, doesn't it? And you're kind of in you know, you fall for this Jamaican culture. And under all the music and all of that, there's also this edge, this dangerous edge to it, which if you're a kind of teenager in London is just so completely appealing, you know. And the Jamaicans were always, generally the rude boys, they were always the ones who had the reputation for standing up against the police when everyone else went home and stuff. There was a real, you couldn't separate the politics and the street politics and the music. I think it all went together at that time. And so, I mean, the political backdrop was kind of reggae infused as well, wasn't it?
Political backdrop of
kind of of that era. So, I mean, you had the riots in 1981, or
you mean the Brixton riots, and then the
Handsworth and
Tottenham and all of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
It's kind of it kind of, to me, that fuses into one kind of fog of. I think I'm describing my loss of brain cells, really, but it was fun.
I think what you're getting at there, or if I can maybe interpret it in a way, is that especially since, interestingly, as you started talking about, you know, 1976 South Africa, and really what happened in the world in the 1960s. And I would describe what was still happening in the 1970s in a music like reggae music, in what was happening in London and politics, as still all kind of being worked out as from the era of the 60s. In other words, the era that was responding to the neo-colonial projects, the liberation movements, particularly and most importantly, I think for the world in terms of its effect, Vietnam, and the effect that had across the world in Africa and Latin America, inspiring liberation movements in the Caribbean, and also in, you know, the heart of the beast in America, and the counterculture that reacted to it there, for example. It was a very different world at that time, and I think there was a very clear cause in the world in terms of which side are you on, and it was right in the middle of the Cold War, so it had all those implications too. And I think the cultural responses that you saw in all forms of music, art, literature, theatre, cinema. I think everything was in one way or another responding to that. So I think with like the reggae as well, the original reggae, and prior to reggae, it was about the 60s independence in Jamaica. Then the development of reggae out of the rocksteady, coming out of in a way, a kind of depression era that followed some years after that, and the waning of the optimism. And when you ask about, South Africa in 1994, we had a similar wave of optimism here. It was an incredible time. That has also subsequently waned, not to say that's a traditional thing that happens. We're in a different time in history now.
It's hard to get a peak of... Sorry, go on.
No, I was just saying, just to finish, that what you're talking about as reggae infusing, say, an era of where the anti-Nazi League existed.
And we had Rock Against Racism concerts. And
exactly, where Thatcherism was doing its damage, where you had you remember like the SPG and the sus laws, and the music in England and the Caribbean as reggae is kind of two slightly different things, same community, but I think very much caught up in what was going on in that time, and so the music was often responding to that.
Looking back, we almost had two different. There was music describing what was happening on the streets of Kingston, and that was picked up by bands in Birmingham and London and Coventry and so on, and they made that into music about what was happening in Britain. And there was this commonality, but also you could see this divergence as well, where I guess the music became in Jamaica, the race wasn't the issue anymore. The issue was it was the Cold War, and there was also it was the sheer violence of the state and the poverty.
Sure, and race and class, absolutely. But yes, a different scenario to your, Windrush generation in the UK, and the subsequent generations. Maybe our friends being they were the second generation.
Yeah, they call them the children of the Windrush now. The people we grew up with. But yeah, there was the older generation who were kind of grateful for the chance to emigrate and to improve their lives and to get jobs, and their kids who didn't have that optimism or that gratitude, but just saw, unemployment and police racism and so on. And music was...
and again, remember, that's also like the difference between living in a Caribbean country and living in the UK, where obviously then you're a minority. It's a different scenario altogether,
Absolutely, yeah. You're a minority, which is a huge thing, and you're also I guess your aspirations are higher in terms of the way you can live. Like, people come from the Caribbean in the 50s and 60s and saw the kind of poverty that not to say that there wasn't deep poverty in the cities here as well, but there was a sense of being happy to get away from the poverty of Kingston or rural Jamaica. I slightly rambled, but yeah, one thing I noticed this year was it was the 40th anniversary of Bob Marley's last concert in Crystal Palace. And as I remember, you went to that. Did you go to that? I vaguely remember you suggesting that we get tickets for that, and
no, I never, unfortunately, friends of mine did, but I never, in fact my old man did as well, but I never saw Bob Marley perform live, unfortunately.
So I've kind of built this whole story in my head where you went, and because I remember going to my mum to ask for tickets, and I think there was £7, and to ask for the money, and she said no. She kind of had this random yes/no switch, so that was a no day, and I didn't see Bob Marley, and then he died a year or so after that.
81, 82, 81.
Yeah, and so it's kind of, I've always reminded her, I still remind her, 40 years on, that she stopped me from seeing Bob Marley in his last ever appearance. And I assumed you went, and so I assumed that was why you'd gone on to be a reggae superstar, and I hadn't. That's basically that's my narrative. But yeah, I'm kind of moving on. I believe you spent some time actually in Angola. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I worked in the ANC full time from 17 years old. I was a printer. And when I was 21, I had volunteered to join the ANC army, which was called Umkhonto weSizwe, which is the Spear of the Nation, is the translation for that. But the abbreviation is MK. So the People's Army in South Africa, the ANC's army, was called MK. Guerrilla Army, whose main rear base was in Angola. Yeah.
And what was that like? How was Angola back then?
It was in the midst of an attempted counter-revolution was taking place, sponsored by apartheid South Africa. So you kind of had in the south, to the south of Angola is a country called Namibia, which was also a colony of South Africa at that time. And they had their own liberation movement called SWAPO. To the north of Namibia is Angola. And the ANC training bases were mostly at that time, earlier in history, around 76, they'd been further south, but our bases were mainly around a few hours north and east of Luanda, which is the capital city. So those were areas that were very much under the government control, Marxist government control. You know, they were one of the only nations, Angola, to give the ANC the right to carry arms openly. And what that meant was the ANC could have their own military training bases, which were based deep in the forests in Angola, very far away from anyone. You'd have some rural villages nearby, but even those were quite far away. So you've just got to imagine a forest situation. That was tactical as well, because you have to be invisible from the sky. Yeah. And so the whole thing's under kind of fairly dense forest. And pretty much, if you imagine, though it was a guerrilla army, if you imagine what a military base is in a place like England, and all everything that the trappings that come with military life, like that, but set in a forest in the middle of the bush. That's kind of what the army was like.
Right, so a perfectly natural setting for a boy who grew up in Golders Green then.
Absolutely. I mean, listen, I used to play on the heath as a kid, so, you know, I had that waxed in no time.
So you knew trees. So, but yeah, I mean, that must have been very weird for a 17-year-old.
Well, by the time I got there, I was 22.
Okay, so
yeah, but I was young,
of course. For a 22-year-old.
Yeah, well, firstly, you know, again, we were in a different time, and I'd been working for some years in the ANC office in London, and a lot of the people who I'd come into contact with, my comrades in the ANC, had come through. You see, what happened is back then, if you were a young person escaping from South Africa, from the townships, you know, many stayed inside, but those that for one reason or the other jumped the fence and wanted to escape and join the ANC, there were two kind of choices that the ANC gave people who were leaving. The one was to go and get education, and the other was to go and join the army. Those were the two choices. And so, you know, on the side of your sort of typical black South African leaving, you'd then have, well, am I going to the army? Do I want to get ready, go fight? Or am I going to study and be of service to the country later when it's liberated? That was the thinking. And many of the students, there was an ANC school set up in Tanzania, where the Tanzanians had given the facilities to the ANC. Many of them went and studied in what at that time the former socialist countries, from Soviet Union to Cuba to China to Vietnam to wherever. And obviously for me, having met many people who were then working in the ANC who had come through either studies or the army, I got very inspired and really, wanted to volunteer. And my thinking at that age was also, you're in the thing and you want to be part of it, and let's go full out here. Let's go 100% with this. And I was, as much of it was me being fascinated and interested by what that experience would be like, and obviously being very committed and wanting to volunteer. So yes, there was culture shock, because there were white members of MK. At the time that I was there was a couple in terms of not the leadership, but the rank and file. Although the particular camp that I trained in, I was the only one in that phase. There was a couple of others in other camps at the same time. So you kind of, you get there and all of a sudden, you're in the middle of the same guys that you've been seeing on TV, on the streets, being shot at and singing freedom songs. You're now singing freedom songs with them in military uniform in the middle of the bush. And it definitely, it was definitely something that took some getting used to. Though it doesn't take long, because you're one of the lads at that point.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I think, not that it's exactly the same, but yeah, when I managed to become a father when I was 18 and left the hood for a while, as you remember. But yeah, people always go like, having kids at 18, that must be weird. And I was like, nah, that you just go with the flow at that age. It's like, here's a new adventure to take on. Having kids now, I'm 55 and I've got two little ones. That's scary. But at 18, no problem. But yeah, it's the lure of adventure, and you jumped in.
I won't deny there was not a romantic element to it. Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure. I mean, like you're saying, Jerry, youth is an amazing thing.
Yeah. It's lucky that we've managed to hold on to it for this long, really. So, and then kind of the big step is, I mean, I haven't provided much background for people who might not understand the history of this, but I mean, broadly, all the ANC leadership had been locked up in the mid-1950s, like Nelson Mandela and the rest, or escaped like your parents did. And so they were living in exile in London, Amsterdam, I believe, or preparing.
Majority in Southern Africa, actually.
Right.
And you had those who'd left South Africa because they wanted to get out, and then they were members of the ANC. There were those that were actually, exile means you're a political exile. If you're within the country, you're arrested, you're wanted. I mean, at some point, I think my dad was number 2 on the most wanted list in South Africa. My mum had been detained and she escaped detention. There's a book out about the escape, written by my dad shortly after she died, called The Unlikely Secret Agent, which I think puts quite a good context on that generation and what leaving the country and escaping to ANC exile meant. Yeah. And the ANC in those years was really building itself in exile and internally at the same time, its political structures. And so, for example, my parents were sent to London by the ANC from East Africa to operate in London on the ANC mission. That's why I was lucky enough to be born in London. That's how it happened.
So, and then jumping forward, so 1994 was obviously the big year, because 1994 was the election, wasn't it? Mandela had been released a year or two before that.
Yes, in 1991. Forgive me for my, I've also haven't got my, it's morning still, in the early 90s. The ANC was unbanned, I think, in 1990. Yeah. And it was shortly after Mandela was released. And then there was legal political campaigning. The ANC and the South African Communist Party were unbanned. And then everything was about mobilizing for the 1994 elections. And my interest at that point, because I've been back in the UK, pursuing a career in music and sound engineering, was to come and witness the 94 elections, because I obviously contributed and been part of what was going on in the ANC.
Yeah, to an extent, your whole life had been shaped by this struggle.
Yeah, we were always in the shadow of that growing up, and then I absolutely, I got involved, and yeah, my life was shaped by it for sure. So coming out in '94 and witnessing the elections was liberating, exhilarating, and
I remember the scenes of people queuing for hours to vote and stuff. That was emotional.
Yes, it was the Uhuru election. It was the liberation election. You could be guaranteed that people would never turn out in those sort of numbers again, because this was the victory of organizations saying it must be one man, one vote. And this is what finally came. And, the inevitable celebratory landslide election that followed that was a very, very special time for South Africa, and I think for the world. People like yourself and numerous people around the world who'd always supported the South African struggle. It was a watershed moment. And the first years of liberation that were here, my brother is into this, or knows this Scottish author, and forgive me for forgetting his name, but he'd sent me a couple of books by this guy, or a couple of links to him, and there was a quote that I remembered where he says something along the lines of, "You should live your life as if you're in the early years of a new democracy," and that really stuck with me, because I know what 94 to 99 was like in South Africa. Yeah. There was this kind of spontaneous feeling that anything's possible here in this society. Anything can happen. Of course, you know what's happened in South Africa since, and
everything wasn't possible. Yeah.
Yeah, but those were really amazing years, and it really did feel like, and that's when me and my partner formed our sound system, and kind of.
So your partner's Jasid.
Yeah, he's a musician, Zimbabwean musician based in South Africa ever since, and he's part of they're now actually a veteran African pop group called Bongo Muffin. In that phase, they were part of the young, what's called the Kwaito generation of artists. That was the music that came out of that phase of the early 90s, and it's very synonymous with the feelings of South African emancipation and liberation. He came from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe has traditionally got a huge sound system and reggae following. In fact, for the whole of Africa, Zimbabwe is one of the key countries for reggae. And you know that Bob Marley performed at their liberation.
At Mugabe's, I was going to say incarceration, that's the wrong word. Mugabe. Inauguration. This is lockdown and childbreak. But totally. And as you know, I travel less in your region, but in West Africa, and I was fascinated by the way reggae has spread. It's really, and basically every country except Nigeria has a huge love of reggae, and Nigeria is just too big, stroke arrogant. I'll erase that bit later.
Oh no, I disagree. No, I disagree. I've got to pull you up on that. Sorry, I can't believe you're saying that, and you're married to a Nigerian too. I mean, unless our experiences are different, I think that you just have to look into the Afrobeat to see the influence of dancehall.
Yes, certainly. But okay, I love Afrobeats, and there's Afrobeats, which is the modern Nigerian pop, and Afrobeat, which is the original Fela Kuti kind of,
Yes.
and, yeah, and doubtless reggae influences. But yeah, it's not reggae. You know, it's not roots reggae. I mean,
Oh,
I'm
no, no,
kind of
it's dancehall. What they've done is they've taken dancehall and they've kind of expressed. So just to get back to the thing, Zimbabwe, say, versus Nigeria, I'd say Nigeria and Ghana have both got like very influential dancehall artists. And the difference between the two is that in Ghana, more so than music, and definitely in Zimbabwe, where Zimbabwean music is like very much follows the Jamaican model in an African way. The Ghanaian and the Nigerian music is much more become a crossover into the what, as you're quite rightly saying, the current pop, the current Afrobeat. But
yeah,
you know,
which is now huge. It's almost like if you imagine reggae was the black music of London in the early 80s, then Afrobeats is combined with a lot of the London styles is the London music of today for young black people.
Right. Okay. I've been away for a long time. I see stuff like this, and people like you know, friends are telling me. But you know, for example, artists from Nigeria who are big, you know, like Burna Boy and Pato Rankin, for example, those are dancehall artists. I think Burna Boy has kind of morphed into something else now, but you know, they've all chatted on our sound. They're all about their favorite artists are the Jamaican artists. They give full salute to them.
That's true. I mean, certainly in terms of today's Jamaican music and today's Nigerian music, they've crossed over and they're often indistinguishable from each other for sure. But yeah, I was certainly thinking back in
about reggae.
Our old fogey, that proper roots reggae. You know, you hear it in Sierra Leone, because in Sierra Leone, Ghana, Gambia. There's the francophone reggae singers like Alpha Blondy and so on, you know, Senegal and Mali. But yeah, it just seemed that Nigerians were the one. Nigeria is a country big enough to craft its own styles in a way that a lot of those countries don't let.
And for sure, the economies, I mean, you know, like South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt being the largest economies, and probably the countries with the largest armies as well in Africa. That's kind of going to reflect that way. I think you're right. They do have that strength. What's interesting is if you look at the Zimbabwean dancehall scene and how it's flourished, and it's as prolific as the Jamaican scene, with new rhythms coming out with like 18 artists all on doing their version of the same rhythm every week, and both in roots reggae, lovers, rubber dub, and primarily the dancehall music. And in the early years of the success of what's called, the genre is called, and it's worth having a look at if you want to search it out, Zim dancehall.
Zim dancehall.
Yeah,
I'm writing.
And the Zim dancehall, you know, in the early years, the big thing, especially when Zimbabwe went through its economic crisis and the dollar became a commodity and a currency, an official currency in the country. A lot of Jamaican artists started touring Zimbabwe, and like you've seen with places like Ghana, an artist like, you know, Busy Signal, for example, or one of the current dancehall artists.
Yeah, every time I went to Gambia, Busy Signal was playing either the week before or the week after. It was like the Jamaican artists are permanently touring West Africa.
It's amazing with an artist like Busy Signal too, because he really does have a huge African fan base. And in Zimbabwe, just to like finish that point, those artists, when they come and they play, especially the first time, they'll fill a stadium just for them, right? You'll get 18,000 people coming to see Busy Signal perform. And, you know, with rare cases that happens in the Caribbean, I mean, maybe Buju's concert, for obvious reasons, last year, you get those sort of numbers. But then an interesting thing started happening. And that is that you'd always have the support acts to the Jamaican artist would be the top Zim dancehall artists building up to the main curtain raiser, right?
Yeah.
And of course, but in recent years, it's the Zim dancehall artists have overtaken now the Jamaican ones in popularity. And
Yeah.
the music has really just become the language of Zimbabwe now. It's quite an amazing scene. I don't think it gets the recognition internationally because unlike, say, the Nigerian music, the Afrobeat, which is, there are Nigerian communities around the world.
Yeah,
There's,
and big communities.
like, Caribbean music, you know, reggae got big, as well as people like Chris Blackwell commercializing it. But there were huge, as you know, Jamaican communities in US, Canada, UK, where the music is just there because the people who come from Jamaica are playing it, and their next door neighbor, the white geezer next door, is hearing it through his walls, and he ends up falling in love with the music, in an idealistic way.
Yeah.
Nigeria has that possibility, and migration has caused that too, hasn't it? In recent years, and hasn't the makeup in London's changed? Some areas.
Yeah, I mean, the young. I mean, if you hear people with West Indian accents now, they're typically going to be older, and if you hear, so African migrants are typically younger. They're typically wealthier, more economically successful, but they have the zeitgeist, and it's the big Nigerian stars will outgross the Jamaican stars easily. Davido and Burna Boy is one of the new ones, and whoever, LP Square, they can fill up proper venues. I mean, the reggae scene here is niche now, as I guess it is in South Africa.
Yeah, I mean, reggae had a very prominent role during the struggle era, and Bob Marley, the bands, Burning Spear were huge. Peter Tosh, as just Peter Tosh, was huge. Bob Marley, and then there's odd ones as well, like, for example, an artist like Don Carlos. Jamaicans always get surprised when they hear just how big Don Carlos was in the 1980s in South Africa. Things changed, obviously, as the world changed around the 1990 mark, the end of the Cold War, and all the subsequent changes of, this globalization that has followed it. But dancehall really came into its own in the early 90s as a result of American, and I'm talking about outside Jamaican kind of culture. The American majors signed a lot of the artists, and in South Africa around the time that I was arriving.
So that's sorry. That's where we kind of began a bit this loop. I mean, you arrived with a bunch of reggae records in 1994 and became a DJ, and you and Justin, your sound system is called the African Sound System. That's right.
African Storm Sound System.
God.
Yeah, African Storm.
Okay.
African Star.
So, the African Sound System would be not a great name for a sound system in Africa, really, would it? The African Storm Sound System. But yeah, I mean, so can you explain how did your career take off from like son of a government minister as you were then to like Mr. Reggae South Africa?
Yes, so when I came to visit, and people who I'd worked for when I was in the army had said to me, you should come back. And basically I was offered a job, and I worked for a few years in the new South African Foreign Service under, Mandela's presidency. And during that time, a friend of mine got me involved in his community reggae show on Saturday afternoons at a station called Voice of Soweto at that time. And he quickly left, and he got into other things, and I ran the show for 2 or 3 years on Saturday afternoons. And it became a bit of a meeting point for people around Joburg who were artists in the growing Kwaito music movement, and who particularly liked dancehall, because in the early Kwaito groups in South Africa, you often found it was a mixture of a traditional kind of Zulu or Xhosa type of rap, a female singer, and there was always, or in many of the big groups, a dancehall artist, kind of like in a way that they've crossed over the music in Nigeria in a way. But this is over Afro pop and South African house. The main music in South Africa, like the music of the streets, is house music, and there are very many hybrids and forms of Kwaito house in South Africa. It's one of the meccas in the world for the music. Reggae, dancehall, we're a subculture here. We're a small niche thing. But we're recognized because it's within urban music, it's black music. So that's how I met Jarseed. His group, Bongo Muffin, were on the rise. And I tried DJing in a few clubs and, unsuccessfully. And I had the radio show, and he said to me, let's form a sound. And he knew all about sound from Zimbabwe, and I knew all about sound from London. And I thought he was crazy, but we did it, and it took off. And, I left my job in the government because the music and the sound system career, I wasn't no longer doing justice to each, and I had to choose one path. And my heart took me into the music. And we ran the sound system from there.
And that's about 20 odd years. How many years?
Yeah, this is our 24th year.
Right.
Of playing every week with some minor.
I mean, that was a phenomenon because, when I came, I was going to Malawi and I managed to get my flight via Johannesburg. And this was 2012. I remember contacting you and you said, make sure you come through on a Thursday. So literally, I think I arrived on Thursday morning and then stayed for 2 or 3 nights. But so I got to see the African Storm in action, and it was great. This massive it's in a theatre, and I think from what I remember, you and me were probably the only 2 white blokes in the place. You were on stage, obviously, and I wasn't. But yeah, obviously,
you had a camera.
I think, I took my little camera, didn't I? And also someone gave me a spliff early, so I got really stoned. And
all your pictures were out of focus, Jerry.
Yeah, it was a new camera, and one of your mates, I don't know what they put in that.
Yeah, it wasn't the weed at all. It was a new camera. That's right. I remember that.
And it was just a proper old school roots reggae party, and I had the best time.
And dancehall, and dancehall.
Yeah, sorry, mustn't forget. And I remember kind of asking if you'd ever dabbled with jungle, and you gave me a disgusted look, like, nah, man, not after 1990.
No, thanks for the great review, by the way. And in fact, the venue, which was called Baseline, we took over the venue in 2017. It's now called the Newtown Music Factory. And you called it a theatre, and I could see why. It's set up like, it feels like you're in, because the stage is very big and there's curtains on it.
It's got that Brixton Academy kind of type.
Yeah, very much. It's a live music venue. And in fact, and many great artists have performed there, but our Thursday night was the only sort of club type night that the venue ever had going, and we did become very successful there. It was our 3rd venue. We kind of moved up in each time we outgrew a venue or a venue had to shut down. There was a couple of thousand people in there. Yeah, it's 1,300, and we, for 2010s until more or less 2017. As you saw, we were filling the venue every week. It was bigger than dancehall and reggae in a sense that it was the public were kind of coming to this thing on Thursday nights, which was great. And of course, we had our core crowd. We always have the core reggae crowd and the core dancehall crowd in Johannesburg, which comprises mainly. It's kind of split 3 ways. It's South Africans, Zimbabweans and Nigerians. And as such, we started, especially when the music started getting big, mixing a little Afrobeat set into proceedings. And the Afrobeat artists as well, because we're here, Johannesburg for a long time was a big destination for the Afrobeat artists to record their music videos.
Right.
So they were often in town, and we'd often get these cameo pass-throughs, and which, you know, brought more Nigerians to our venue, and Nigerians love dancehall anyway. So it's kind of split along those three ways. And when you say the night you were there, we were the only two kind of white guys in the club, of course, you know, we've had, I mean, white people come through. Often they're mainly tourists, are very interested in the venue and the night. And whoever comes, you know, I'd say that we don't quite reflect South African demographics.
I mean, no club night ever reflects demographics of the city it's in, you know. But no, I mean, I'm not saying, I had the best time.
You sure did, because, you know, we all saw you skanking in the front row, Jerry.
I was there, like the light shining off my
head.
Good
moves, man. Got good moves on you.
Watch it, watch it.
Yeah.